Hello everyone. The title of my paper is Ways of Seeing and Reimagining Community, To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. Margaret Holman's in her introduction to the 2023 Norton Critical Edition of To the Lighthouse reminds readers of the many ways that Woolf's fifth novel has been judged throughout the years, from being an experiment to a social commentary, a political novel, and even a ghost story. Let's take a look back at some of the first reactions. On May 5, 1927, reviewer Arthur Sidney McDowell claimed that, quote, "To the Lighthouse is as elastic as a novel can be. It has no plot, though it has a scheme and a motive. It shows characters and outline rather than in the round, and while it depends almost entirely on the passing of time, it expands or contracts the time sense very freely." This is from the Times Literary Supplement. 3 days later, Louis Kronenberger shared his opinion in the New York Times. "To the Lighthouse," he said, "is a book of interrelationships among people and the characters, the means for giving to the story its harmony and unity, its focal points." Reviews like these can prompt some provoking questions. Just what is the subject of the novel? What are its core concerns, themes? Are there other ways to describe it, other than what has become standard criticism? And how does the novel relate to the topics of this conference? I'm here to offer my thoughts on these subjects. Two conference themes have shaped my thoughts regarding the ways we can read To the Lighthouse. Ways of seeing and reimagining communities. Woolf's interest in reframing the conversation concerning modern women and modern fiction involved interrupting mainstream discourse concerning identity, sexuality, and community. For example, in her first three novels, The Voyage Out, Night and Day, and Jacob's Room, she explored various ways in which perception shaped the way women understood their social realities and possibilities. In The Voyage Out, Rachel Vinrace's innocence shapes her surprised encounter with Richard Dalloway, interrupting and perhaps corrupting her ideas about the nature of romantic love. In Night and Day, a somewhat conventional social novel, we meet two men and two women who navigate complex romantic misunderstandings as they come to grips with their increasingly modern lives. While her first two novels were structured in straightforward narrative styles, her third, Jacob's Room, edges closer to interior monologue, free indirect discourse, and the stream of consciousness that we find in Mrs. Dalloway, her first truly experimental novel. Published approximately halfway through her career, To the Lighthouse introduces readers to a three-part novel which builds on Woolf's increasingly experimental style. Although readers encounter a variety of characters, at its center are Mrs. Ramsay, the matriarch, and a painter named Lily Briscoe. This novel explores ways of seeing and notions about the nature of community, who belongs, who doesn't, evoked by interactions among a house full of guests. Mrs. Ramsay's view of family life, which unfolds throughout Part 1, can be characterized as inclusive, and thus she invites friends and acquaintances who comprise the satellite around her own family: Minta Doyle and Paul Rayleigh, Charles Tansley, William Banks, Augustus Carmichael, and Mrs. Carmichael. She does not regard them all with equal amounts of affection. For instance, Charles Tansley she views with some skepticism, but also with a sense of humor. She could not help laughing herself sometimes at his peculiarities. What she prizes most is the community they create together, with herself at the center. Lily's way of seeing the world and her place in it contrasts most starkly with Mr. Ramsay, a philosopher, and most harmoniously with Mrs. Ramsay, although the two women do not agree on every idea about how to live one's best life. In this three-part story, Woolf weaves a compelling narrative grounded in how we see, who we see, and the kinds of communities we imagine creating for ourselves. She developed her theories regarding identity, sexuality, and community throughout her fiction, her letters and diary entries and essays. Although today's focus is on To the Lighthouse, I want to briefly discuss two other works for purposes of context that show her thinking regarding women, freedom of thought and choice, and relationships with men. In A Room of One's Own, published shortly after To the Lighthouse, Woolf explains her feminist ideas regarding the acquisition of knowledge and freedom of expression. She paints the scene of a woman daring to walk into the gardens at the fictional Oxbridge and is promptly reprimanded by a beetle for stepping off of the official path. The message was clear: men only, women forbidden. This scenario illustrates what she perceived to be a corrosive imbalance between opportunities and avenues for women and those set apart for men. Throughout this quasi-fictional essay, she expressed her frustration, writing that in this gender-limited garden, quote, "Gate after gate seemed to close with gentle finality behind me. Innumerable beetles were fitting innumerable keys into well-oiled locks. The treasure house was being made secure for another night." For Woolf scholars, A Room of One's Own acts as a kind of manifesto, or at least a touchstone for much, if not most, of Woolf's work, whether fiction or nonfiction, as it concerns ways of seeing and reimagining community. If one is a woman, one sees things differently than if one is a man, of course. We can extend this male/female opposition to whether one is straight or gay, young or old, male or female, rich or poor. A salient example of the development of this idea in Woolf's fiction is Orlando, a novel in which the theory is fully fleshed out. The title character, a young man, wakes up halfway through the narrative to discover that he is now a woman, which presents an entirely new set of challenges. As a young man, Orlando could go where he pleased with whom he pleased, but the young woman finds that ordinary life for a woman can be fraught with dangers, great and small. In fact, all 9 of Woolf's novels challenge the received philosophies of the time regarding women's educational opportunities as well as their place in society. After all, what opportunities could a woman have, given that until the 1920s she could not own property or vote? For an unmarried woman, life in the early 20th century could be quite restrictive. Thus, in To the Lighthouse, Lily is seen as a spinster, devoting her time to painting. Woolf had felt this restriction in her own life and thus chafed against these rules, parroted by other women, that would have her marry and produce children, to obey what Woolf would later name the angel in the house in A Room of One's Own. And To the Lighthouse, Woolf reimagines what community could become if everyone could accept each other as they want to be in terms of their own gifts and the ways in which they would like to fulfill their destinies, instead of a society in which everyone is forced to play by the same societal rules. How does the image of the lighthouse become an important symbol or motif? Might we read the word lighthouse as house of light, implying that Woolf created a narrative that would enlighten her readers through a new way of seeing identity and community? Or is the lighthouse part of a larger mythology around the nature of knowledge and the process of revelation? Perhaps we can understand the lighthouse as a combination of these possibilities. In her foreword to the HBJ 1981 edition, Eudora Welty describes the rhythm created by the, quote, silent strokes of light that pass over the sleeping house as the pulse that underlies the novel's structure as a whole, quote, forming a pattern of waking and sleeping, presence and absence, living and living no longer, between clamorous memory and lapses of mind, between the rushing of love and the loosening of the hand of sleep. For Welty, then, the lighthouse seems to embody the notion of eternity in the midst of change. Susan Choi, in her introduction to the 2023 edition, notes that the revelatory quality of the novel that speaks universally to anyone, the book's embodiment of those least tangible yet most powerful entities of consciousness, time, and death, derives directly from Woolf's particular experiences, and not merely the incidents, such as the deaths of her mother and her sister and her brother, but the nature of experience itself. This from her introduction. Patricia Lockwood, in her notes to the Penguin Classics Deluxe Edition, also 2023, recognizes Mrs. Ramsay as the heart of the novel, a, quote, human holiday, the maypole in every month. She is the reason for the gathering, the centrifugal force around which everyone else revolves. Lockwood uses the word plenitude to describe Mrs. Ramsay's presence. With her, all possibilities begin. She feels, quote, waves, winds, pulses of suspicion about her own nature, end quote. At the lighthouse, as the lighthouse beam pulses, she identifies with that light. Of Lily Briscoe, Lockwood notes that readers identify with the idea that she is, quote, striving and unformed, a tamer flower than she wants to be, end quote, but that she is also, quote, required to stand in front of her easel and record the year through Mrs. Ramsay, the upright afternoon. To read Lockwood's preface is to feel a sense of anticipation. What magic will Woolf unfold this time? How will this novel illuminate our understanding of what it means to be human? In her introduction to this same edition, Hermione Lee sums up the novel this way, quote, To the Lighthouse is the story of a marriage and a childhood. It is a lamentation of loss and grief for powerful, loved, dead parents, which Virginia Woolf wanted to call an elegy rather than a novel. It is less apparently about the English class structure and its radical break with Victorianism after the First World War. It demonstrates the urgent need for an art form which could, though with great difficulty, adapt to and register that break. Lee's notes provide what she understands as the meaning of Lily's painting, so central to the sense-making of the novel that, quote, Woolf builds into the novel a commentary of her own processes as a novelist. So Woolf's fifth novel represents her growing commitment to and success with stretching the boundaries of the novel and reshaping it as a truly modern genre. She very purposefully plays with, quote, ways of seeing and helps us to reimagine what community can and should be. These introductory comments from Welty, Lee, Lockwood, and Choi demonstrate the continuing influence and impact of Woolf's work today, nearly 100 years after its publication. I agree with their assessments as a whole, but with our conference themes in mind, would offer this. The Lighthouse not only represents the way we see the passing of time and the changes in ourselves and our communities, even the definition of family and community, but with every rotation of this light/knowledge, although we may see the same things, each of us understand them in a different way. Perspective mattered a great deal to Woolf. Her 9 novels are 9 beams of reflected light through the prism of her experience. To the Lighthouse constitutes one of those visions. I have taken a particular shard of that experience as my own perspective on the novel, allowing the light to fall on Lily and Mrs. Ramsay in particular. The rest of my presentation will focus on another way we can consider Woolf's 5th novel. Coming as it did on the heels of Mrs. Dalloway, the narrative arc of To the Lighthouse gives further consideration to one of the themes that fascinated Woolf, that a female identity should not depend on the male gaze for affirmation or for permission to express herself in a way that varies from what may be deemed conventional. As I've pointed out, as early as The Voyage Out, Woolf voices her skepticism of this notion. To the Lighthouse develops in part through the perspective of a painter, Lily Briscoe. Through Lily's character and her observations, Woolf once again asks readers to consider the transactional nature that we all undertake of creating an identity, and to consider that who we are in the world consists of a collaboration between people, their dreams, ideas, and their environments. A side note, in Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa shares a kiss with Sally Seton, her girlhood friend, before making her decision to marry Richard Dalloway. Sally seems to represent the more authentic Clarissa before she settles for a conventional marriage role. Sally reminds Clarissa of her true identity, playing a part in her epiphany at the conclusion of the narrative. Septimus Smith, who Clarissa never meets, she only hears of his suicide, is also part of her awakening as well. Does Clarissa settle for conventionality at the conclusion? I would argue that she re-enters the party after learning of Smith's suicide, having absorbed the gravity and seriousness of that event, but allowing her to make all aspects of her experience part of her life. She felt, quote, she felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. He made her feel the beauty, made her feel the fun, end quote. As in Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf's stream of consciousness narrative style into The Lighthouse reflects multiple perspectives. The structure could be compared to the reflected light of a prison. Lily's epiphany at the conclusion brings readers back to the trope of light when she thinks, quote, I have had my vision, adding the last touch of paint to her picture of Mrs. Ramsay and James. A truth about herself, Mrs. Ramsay, James, and the experience itself is deferred across these myriad conversations and observations. The one steady light seems to be Mrs. Ramsay, as Patricia Lockwood says, quote, like a spectrum with one long, continuous, revolving stroke. Her fifth novel begins with 6-year-old James eagerly anticipating the promised voyage to the lighthouse, only to have his hopes dashed by his father. They would only be able to make the journey if it was fine, and Mr. Ramsay dully proclaims, but it won't be fine. Notably, James recognizes his father's capricious moods, supported by another guest, Charles Tansley, also a philosopher, whom the children thought of as difficult and obtuse. But in this house of 7 children and various guests, Mrs. Ramsay connects them, organizes them, and embraces all of their differences. Lily seems to be the only one among the group who stands at more of a distance, who observes rather than fully participates. She uses her artist's point of view as a means of seeing each person individually, but simultaneously as members of a community. She understands that Mrs. Ramsay desires to bridge the exterior divides, but that she also has a disapproving side. In the opening pages of the novel, we observe the social dynamics of the family and their guests, their various interactions operating as small negotiations for social position. Mrs. Ramsay, as the matriarch, pulls them together. As the story progresses, we learn more about how their relationships are interconnected. For instance, Charles Tansley, who Mrs. Ramsay thinks of as, quote, an awful prig, oh yes, an insufferable bore, and, quote, an odious little man, end quote, is part of the company at the house, sharing meals and walks. Mrs. Ramsay is portrayed then as both an independent thinker as well as a traditional matriarchal figure. She believes strongly in family and holds traditional values, and yet her inner life reveals a more thoughtful side to her personality. She is more complex than she may appear. This understanding of Mrs. Ramsay is crucial to understanding Woolf's vision. Mrs. Ramsay, like Lily, sees to the heart of things and has an intuitive understanding of the world and her place in it. The first time I read To the Lighthouse and encountered Mrs. Ramsay, I thought of Forster's A Passage to India and the mantra of the luminous Mrs. Moore, who urged us to, quote, only connect. In Woolf's novel, Mrs. Ramsay creates and maintains community among her family and friends. Even in death, she is mother and the reason for the promised journey to the lighthouse. Although I would argue that Mrs. Moore develops into an increasingly transcendent figure by the end of Forster's novel, for Mrs. Ramsay, her presence, even after she dies, radiates a deep kind of wisdom, the kind that outlasts her death. Just as Woolf's novel depicts life as constantly moving, nothing in the novel is still. Lily's painting attempts to capture the radiance and vitality that was Mrs. Ramsay. What more to the core story could there be than this? The presence and the relationship between Mrs. Ramsay and Lily represented not as they presented themselves as individuals, but as their relationship existed. There was uncertainty, the blur of not knowing, but this statement by Lily, this final line down the center of the painting, underscores the notion that she could know nothing more, that at the center of the chaos there was already a kind of knowing, a finishing and a drawing together of all the elements that had made the relationship deep and lasting. Perhaps Mrs. Ramsay was a difficult personality to pin down, but in the end and at her center, she was a woman who understands life's complexities, as reflected in Lily's painting. Quote, "There it was, her picture, yes, with all its greens and blues, its lines running up and across, its attempt at something. She looked at her canvas. It was blurred. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, she drew a line there in the center. It was done. It was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue, I have had my vision." Lily, who spends most of her time navigating the social dynamics of the group, realizes that she shouldn't have struggled. She needn't have, that not only was she already complete and had been all along, but more importantly, she understands that through her way of seeing, represented in the painting by the line down the center, she had created a community that included her. Thank you so much.